مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الجهل نعم أحيانا، ولكنه يشكل خطورة في أحيان أخرى. بوجود محيطين هائلين في شرق أمريكا وغربها، وبلدان صديقة في شمال البلاد وجنوبها، قد يستمتع الأميركيون بنعم الجهل بشأن ما يحدث في العالم، فالملايين منهم لا يعرفون الفرق بين حلف الناتو والاتحاد الأوروبي، ولا يعرفون من هو رئيس جمهورية فرنسا أو رئيس وزراء بريطانيا. الكثير لا يعرفون إن كانت الهند بلدان هندسية أو مسلمة. ملايين الأمريكيين يعتقدون أن هناك 100,000 جنودي أمريكي في العراق، في حين أن الرقم الحقيقي هو 2000 تقريبا. كما يعتقد الكثير أننا ننفق 25% من الميزانية الفيدرالية على المساعدات الخارجية، في حين أن الرقم الحقيقي هو أقل من 1%. هذا الجهل الذي يسببه موقع أمريكا الجغرافي أصبح يشكل خطورة على الأهل، والعالم اليوم أصبح متصلا ببعضها أكثر من قبل. فيما يحصل في أوكرانيا يؤثر على أسعار الوقود في تكساس وأوهايو، وما يحصل في الصين يؤثر على أسعار السيارات والبرادات والغسالات في فلوريدا وأوكلاهوما. كلما عرفنا أقل أصبحنا معرضين للخطر أكثر، وكلما عرفنا أكثر جهزنا أنفسنا بشكل أفضل لمواجهة مشاكل العالم. لمناقشة ما يعرفه الأميركيون وما لا يعرفونه حيال الشؤون الخارجية، يسرني أن أرحب بخبيرين درسا هذا الموضوع عن قثب، لورا سيلفر وكولين دويك. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. The famous question from our Watergate scandal, now 50 years old, was, what did you know and when did you know it? We're going to apply those questions to what Americans know or don't know about their knowledge of world affairs. And I'm delighted to have Laura Silver and Colin Duake to help take us through this very interesting and very important issue. All right, through your polling research, you have taken a close look at what Americans know and don't know about the world and America's role in it. So let's start with the good news, Laura. What do Americans really know something about?
It's a great question. So we asked 12 different questions about a range of different topics. So we asked everything from, can you recognize this leader? And we showed a picture of Kim Jong-un, to which region in China has the highest per capita population of Muslims, and 10 other questions. So they kind of spanned issues of geography, issues of political leadership. And what we found across those 12 questions is that Americans know about half of them on average. Whether or not they know the ones that you think are most consequential may vary based on your interests. When we asked, for example, a question about which countries are not a part of NATO, we found that 56% of people knew Ukraine was not a part of NATO. That seems quite consequential in the context of the current frictions with Russia and the war. We also asked about the capital of Afghanistan, which is consequential when you think about the US withdrawal. So Americans vary in what they know, and it really depends on what we ask them.
So can, Colin, when you look at some of this data, can you break it down in terms of any particular characteristic, age, race, politics, geography? Do Democrats or Republicans know more about the world, education, that sort of thing? Is there one key indicator that tells you this group really knows the world?
Sure, thanks, Rob. Well, in a way, that it turns out that I mean, Americans we like to poke fun at ourselves for how little we know about foreign affairs, but actually, it turns out the results are surprisingly good. More people know more than you might think about facts regarding international relations. To answer your question, I think the single most striking thing was education and interest level. In other words, it doesn't track with party or ideology, right? Democrats and Republicans seem to know about the same amount. I don't think it was so much ideology or age. It was more level of education and level of interest. And one of the most interesting things was that really committed liberal Democrats and really committed conservative Republicans both know more than those who are just less political or less interested. And actually, both of those extremes also tend to be more committed to America's role in the world.
All right, so if the two ends of the political spectrums are basically well-informed, Laura, what's the bad news when you look at your data? Does that mean that the vast middle of Americans are pretty ignorant about the world?
I wouldn't use the term pretty ignorant, but I think exactly what Colin said is correct. We see that people who have more interest, perhaps who are more committed to finding information or more likely to seek out news, those people tend to know more. It's actually maybe an encouraging story in some ways, which is that the people who are more committed to finding information are able to find it accurately and answer these questions. The people who aren't seeking out that information tend to have less of it.
So that's very interesting. Does this apply to what you would call urgent issues and important issues, or does it apply only to the headline urgent issues? So, for example, Ukraine is a headline urgent issue. Climate change is an important issue, but one that rarely makes it into the front page of newspapers. How do you separate, or can one separate between the urgent and the important?
That's not a distinction we tried to draw, but I will say that on some of the questions, for example, some of the more evergreen things, for example, the flag of India, which hasn't changed in recent memory, obviously, or the euro symbol, which has existed since the euro was created, we generally see that people who have more interest and more education are more able to identify those. But in some of these cases, for example, the euro symbol, more Americans in general also know it. That's something that's not necessarily a front page issue, but maybe an econ textbook issue, or both, depending on if you're reading the business section.
And so, Colin, when you look at the data, are you heartened by, so you're pleasantly surprised at the level of familiarity with international affairs?
I was. I mean, I think the numbers were higher than I actually would have expected. I've been teaching this stuff for years. The general conventional wisdom on public opinion is that, to be blunt, Americans just don't know very much about foreign policy, but that doesn't prevent them from having reasonable opinions. For example, one way to put it would be an American citizen might not know where Kabul is, or that it's the capital of Afghanistan, but might have an opinion on whether his or her children should be fighting there, right? That would be one way to think of it. But in this case, it also turns out that they do know that Kabul is the capital of Afghanistan, which is I think, good news.
I mean, the conventional knock is that Americans don't even know that the two countries with whom we share borders, or the time-honored question of what percentage of the federal budget do we give to foreign aid. Do the statistics clarify that people have a good sense of these really fundamental, basic questions? Laura?
We didn't ask about some of those things, so it's hard for me to say, but I agree with Colin's assessment, which is essentially you can have well-formed opinions without knowing some of these. But that said, we do find that knowledge of some of these issues is related to attitudes. So we find, for example, that people who know the capital of Afghanistan are more likely to say that the US did a poor job managing the withdrawal. That might be because these people who know the capital are also more likely to follow certain news sources, which highlighted the withdrawal in a specific way. We can't disaggregate that, but we do find essentially that attitudes can be related to these knowledge questions. Another example is that people who know where the US embassy in Israel is currently located are more likely to think current relations with Israel are good.
Interesting. And in terms of Ukraine, Colin, when you take a look at the data, do you find any correlation between or what correlates with a strong position in support of the Ukrainian people and leadership in repelling the Russian aggression?
Well, a couple of surprising things, maybe. One is that Republicans have been about as supportive as Democrats. So again, you might think that the average Republican is going to be skeptical of just anything President Biden's doing because of that party difference. But at least on the issue of Ukraine, the last few months, there's been solid majority support from Republicans for a lot of the things we've been seeing, like arms shipments to Ukraine, and similarly from Democrats. So there's not much of a difference there. Insofar as there is a correlation, I'd have to look at this more closely, but my guess is it would correlate with what Laura found, which is it has more to do with interest level, with political education, with graduate training, those sorts of differences.
All right. When we come back after the break, I'm going to ask our guests about the impact of COVID on Americans' engagement with the world and interest in what's going on around the world, and how any of this might affect whether and how Americans vote in our November congressional elections. In just a moment. It's Washington's top tourist attraction, a temple to freedom, unity, and democracy that is open to millions of visitors 24 hours a day, every day of the year, at the far western end of the National Mall, the stunningly beautiful green space at the heart of America's purpose-built capital city. I'm referring to the Lincoln Memorial, our national commemoration in honor of our 16th president, which is currently celebrating its 100th birthday. Built to memorialize Abraham Lincoln and featuring a mammoth 19-foot-high sitting statue of the man who led our nation through war and peace during the Civil War. The Lincoln Memorial took 12 years, but only $300,000 to rise out of dredged-out swampland along the banks of the Potomac. In the century since Lincoln's son Robert joined President Warren G. Harding and Chief Justice and former President William Howard Taft at the dedication ceremony, the memorial has been the setting for historic events in the civil rights movement, such as a concert by famed Black opera singer Marian Anderson, who had been denied entry to the auditorium of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1939, to the first ever presidential speech to a Black civil rights group, Harry Truman's address to the NAACP in 1947, and of course, the historic I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King during the March on Washington in 1963. To the Lincoln Memorial, happy birthday is very well deserved. Our guests again today include Laura Silver. Laura is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center. She is an expert in international survey research and writes about international public opinion on a wide variety of topics. She is the lead author of a new Pew survey highlighting what Americans know about the world and what we think about international engagements. Also joining us is Colin Dweck. Colin is a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a prominent Washington think tank. He has served as a foreign policy advisor on several Republican presidential campaigns and as a consultant for the Departments of State and Defense and the National Security Council. All right, let's take a step back from some of the immediate questions and just get your impression, if you will, on the events of the last 2 years. The biggest global news story, of course, was the pandemic. When you think about how Americans engage with the world, Colin, what do you think the impact of the pandemic was? Did it make Americans more worldly, concerned about what happens in faraway places and the impact it can have in their hometowns? Or did it make Americans more insular, focused on what's going on locally and on themselves more than ever before?
Well, I think there the answer actually does break down more on party lines, unlike some of the things we've talked about so far. What I found researching, for example, Republican foreign policy opinion the last few years is that you would get some polls where a majority of Republican voters would say that they felt that the pandemic was evidence that the United States needed to be more self-sufficient. I mean, that's how they would put it, needed to assert its sovereignty more energetically. And that's a trend we've seen among Republicans for several years, right? Tracking with the Trump phenomenon, kind of a reassertion of American nationalism. Whereas for Democrats, you really get a very different type of answer. If anything, the pandemic was taken as evidence that this is exactly the sort of reason that we need multilateral cooperation and international engagement and global institutions to tackle these challenges together. So the pandemic had a big impact, I think, on how Americans view international relations, but I think that they saw it, at least on left and right, they saw it through those pre-existing assumptions. And so people came to very different conclusions based on whether they were liberal or conservative.
When Laura, when you look at the statistics over time, do you find just a greater intensity of American interest in the world over time, or has it been relatively static over time?
That's a good question. There are probably a number of ways to measure this, but one that we did quite recently, so in May, was we asked a question. It's two-sided. So one side is, it's best for the future of our country to be active in world affairs. And the other side is, we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems here at home. And like Colin said, this is very much a partisan question. So 65% of Republicans say we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems at home. 60% of Democrats say the opposite, say it's best for the future of our country to be active in world affairs. Interestingly, at least on that question, which clearly could be tapping the pandemic, it could be tapping Russian invasion of Ukraine or numerous other global issues, at least on that question, there's been no increased sense that we should be active in world affairs in recent years, so pre and post pandemic. But the partisan angle really shines through. We also asked a question about whether many of the problems facing this country can be solved by working with other countries or few. And again, this is incredibly partisan in nature. So 60% of Republicans say few of the problems facing their country can be solved by working with others, and 67% of Democrats say the opposite. That one's not a trend question, so I don't know if that one's shifted over the course of the pandemic, but it is interesting to look at the ways in which kind of partisan attitudes are shaping whether or not people want to be engaged overseas or not.
And do those partisan attitudes have an impact from the data on Americans' willingness to support alliances and to support allies, whether it's NATO or other treaty allies that we have?
Yeah, so in the exact context of the current Ukraine war, I would say that we actually see much more bipartisanship, as Colin mentioned. But generally speaking, when we ask questions about whether or not we should work with other countries, whether or not we should work with allies and things of that sort, we tend to see very large partisan differences. Republicans, on balance, tend to be more on the go it alone or make sure we follow America's interests above compromising with allies, and Democrats tend to say the opposite.
Rob, can I add a thought to that?
Please, go ahead. Yes.
And I agree with everything Laura just said, but there is one thing that I found interesting over the years, even during the Trump years, which is I was surprised how many Republican voters still say when it comes to core military alliances that they support those alliances, right? And so whether it's Western European alliances, Japan, South Korea, and even in the Middle East, so this might be of interest to your viewers, you do get a solid majority of Republicans willing to support U.S. military alliances in the region, which is not necessarily what you'd think. But when it comes to broader questions of, should we look out for our own interests? Should we be skeptical of multilateralism? Absolutely. There's a big philosophical difference that's only gotten bigger over the years. And as Laura said, it's going to be interpreted through your view as to whether you think, Vladimir Putin's to blame or Biden is to blame. But it is certainly an issue, this midterm election.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Laura and Colin, for helping take us into the minds of the American people and what they know about the world, what they don't know about the world. But it is a hopeful story, and that is itself something to cheer. So thank you for joining us on Untitled Washington. It's the 50th anniversary of the Watergate scandal this summer, and there is a flurry of books, articles, and television documentaries helping a new generation of Americans relive what was long considered the worst constitutional crisis in American history, a crisis that cut short the presidency of Richard Nixon, who resigned less than halfway through his second term. But the real headline of many of these stories is that as bad as Watergate was, it was nothing compared to the assault on our democracy that occurred on January 6th, 2021, and that in many ways continues today. For all those 50-year-old film documentaries on TV now, there is a real-life, real-time show that is gripping the nation, the televised hearings of the special congressional inquiry into the events of January 6th. We all basically knew the facts. We watched much of this unfold before our eyes that terrible day. But what we are seeing and hearing for the first time is how deep, huge, and audacious the conspiracy really was. We're seeing and hearing how far the planning went to circumvent the will of the people and create a legal fiction that would allow false electors to choose Donald Trump as president. We're seeing and hearing how indifferent the president was to the well-being of his vice president, Mike Pence, who was threatened with death for refusing to go along with the schemes of crazy people and madmen. And we are seeing and hearing how high officials, including the Attorney General at the time, knew that the president was propagating and promoting a totally unfounded lie and did nothing about it. Say what you want about Nixon, our paranoid president who got himself enmeshed in a two-bit burglary by third-rate thieves that destroyed his presidency. At least he had the decency and respect for the Constitution to resign, sparing himself and the nation the pain and embarrassment of an impeachment by the House of Representatives, let alone a trial in the Senate. President Trump, by contrast, was twice impeached by the House, only to survive 2 trials in the Senate. The story of January 6th is politics, not history, as Trump continues to hold sway over the Republican Party and is its odd-on favorite to run again for president in 2024. One key factor will be the place of January 6th in our national consciousness. Will it remain a vivid reminder of how the Trump presidency almost didn't end with his election defeat? Or will January 6th fade from memory the way Watergate is for millions of Americans, as distant as the Civil War? The answer to that question is up to us. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن المواقف الأمريكية حيال الحرب في أوكرانيا، تواصلوا معي رجاءً عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على رابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.